Is this real? Or is this just a ride? The world is like a ride. You think it's real? It's just a ride. We can change it anytime we want. It's only a choice between fear and love. The world is like a ride. You think it's real? It's just a ride. We can change it anytime we want. It's only a choice between fear and love. The ride goes up and down, round and round. It has thrills and chills, and it's very brightly colored. It's up and down, round and round.
Greetings, programs. It is December 17th, 2017. You're in Red Pill Sunday School. Welcome, welcome. You're also tuned in to UCY.TV. I'm your host, Clint, and hey, let's go right into this today because we're on a continuing mission to find out the truth, the real truth, not the patriotic version, not the mixed up version, not the Stockholm Syndrome version, not the version we were taught in public school. Today I'm going to talk about a little thing called the national emergency, the declaration of a national emergency compared to war, which are essentially the same thing. The powers, of course, I think most people are familiar with some of the powers. If not, you will be by the end of today, that are granted to the President of the United States, and for that matter, in every country that has a constitution. And don't be fooled, America is not the only country with a constitution. Constitutions are a dime a dozen. They're not really that special, but what they do is they always give every country, every nation, the power to take complete and utter military control, as we talked about last week when Lincoln declared his several executive orders. Really the first time those were used in any type of situation like that. So we're going to be talking about that, how it works, and essentially that it suspends the Constitution. I don't know why. I really don't understand why people still think that the Constitution, for one thing, as public citizens, has anything to do with us. But secondly, why you even think it has anything to do with anything. You know, something that can be banished or go away in an instant. Something that can be declared null and void just by the declaration by the corporate CEO of government, the commander-in-chief. Just, you know, if he can suspend the Constitution, just as every other dictator has ever suspended their constitutions, whether it be France or Hitler in Germany, and we'll talk about that, because Germany had this, Hitler had the same exact wording in their constitution that we do. And so you got to understand that this is a document that can be turned on and turned off at any time as far as its regulation over government. And I want to be clear that in a declaration of war, which is the same as a declaration of emergency. You remember, let's give you an example. Obama declared an emergency, a national emergency, when the swine flu was going on, and declared a national emergency. That suspends any constitutional protections. It gives the government the right to do all those things that you're afraid of. Round you up, force vaccinate, etc., etc. And as long as the president declares or redeclares that emergency every year, that is the requirement that Congress gave him. Congress can stop this at any time, just so you know. Never think that Congress has its hands tied or can't do anything. No. Congress makes the laws. Congress is never out of control. You think the Federal Reserve is actually independent of Congress when Congress is its creator, its God? You're wrong. Congress creates laws that then ties Congress's hands from doing anything, and of course they can blame the law, and they can blame the Federal Reserve as if they have no power over it. That is like saying that you have no power over your child. It is a ridiculous, completely illogical, unreasonable fallacy. And it's brilliant when you go and you look at these rules that they made I'll probably do a show on the Federal Reserve at some point, because it's always good to dispel the rumors that were created by such figureheads in the truth movement as G. Edward Griffin, Alex Jones, and all these guys who just utterly lie about the Federal Reserve, whether they know it or not. I mean, they repeat themselves, right? When you're simply repeating other people in your same movement, then you're really not sourcing any material. There was no late night meeting. There was no crazy Jekyll Island. It was all a lie. It was a way to sell a book. And a clever title, I'll admit. There's way more of that stuff going on today than there ever was then. But let's not get sidetracked with that. We'll do that some other time. I want to specifically start today with a reading, if you will. Now, again, I said in a previous show that there's been a lot of people that have spent a lot of time and effort putting together, well, like myself, like Patrick Jordan, like so many others out there who have gathered and collated information. This particular thing, you can search this out for yourself. I actually took it because it was kind of poorly written, a lot of spelling errors and stuff. I took it and I started rewriting it for a documentary. And, documentaries are humongous efforts to sit down and do. So, I've got a lot of scripts, a lot of things I've researched that should be in documentaries, but I just don't have the time. It's just so much. But War and Emergency Powers is the title of this, a special report on the national emergency in the United States of America. Again, you can search this, War and Emergency Powers, a special report on the national emergency in the United States of America. It was researched by a bunch of people. Dr. Gene Schroeder was the top guy. Alvin Jenkins, Jerry Russell, a lot of guys that I should, you can check it out for yourself. They're credited. What they found, I found this a long time ago, fortunately, and it really gave me an insight into how things actually work. And it basically boils down, again, to war and emergency powers. Now, war and emergency powers, again, they're pretty much the same thing. When you declare an emergency, you have to understand, when the president declares an emergency exists, he's literally, not just figuratively, but literally declaring a war against the emergency. Now, we know that presidents can't declare war. Only Congress can. But it's the same concept as we had during the Civil War. Because, again, you've got an out-of-control government here. This thing has no checks and balances anymore. It's a completely international, absolutely, completely out of control. The states do not have control over the United States anymore. That is not to say that Congress does not, but you got to realize the whole competition thing, the whole left-right, the whole Republican-Democrat, it's all bullshit. It's a very well played out schema that makes you think that there is competition, that there's competition between the Federal Reserve, for instance, and the Congress. There's not. If there was, Congress could so easily change it at the drop of a hat. They could write off the debt if they wanted to. They could close the Fed tomorrow if they wanted to, but they don't want to. You see, the Congress created the United States, the executive branches within, and all the departments and corporations within, because then they have an excuse. They can put the blame on the corporation, put the blame on the leader, put the blame on whoever they appoint or the president appoints to that position. They have total control over the... You got to understand that Congress has total control over the law, right? The Federal Reserve must follow congressional law. There is no if, and, or but about it. Now, does that mean that the Federal Reserve can't make rules? Do you understand that when you say an independent... If you type in independent agencies of government, the first thing you're going to get, I think, is a Wikipedia page. And it will list all the independent agencies of government. And so we say, the Federal Reserve is private. The Federal Reserve is independent. No, it's not. It's under Congress, who placed it into this giant holding corporation we call the United States, so it's out of Congress's hands. They pass the laws, they regulate it, and then they allow everything from the post office to the Securities and Exchange Commission to the Social Security Commission, the board. They're all set up the same way. They have boards. It's all the same. The Federal Reserve is no different and really not that special compared to all these different things. They're independent agencies of government. Now that has become a big fallacy, that it's private, meaning separate from government. Absolutely not. It's still under Congress. However, all of these institutions can make rules. Now I compare that to you. You who have custody of your children. You who can make rules for your children in your house, but under no circumstances can you break the law. You can't break the law, but you can make rules that do not affect the law. And of course, Congress leaves all kinds of loopholes just so that it can do that. It's organized crime. All right, there's nothing special. There's nothing separate, which means foreign or private. It doesn't exist, folks. It's the biggest lie, the biggest distraction that you'll ever come across. The Federal Reserve is not owned by bankers. That is a big, fat, fallacious lie. Anyway, I'm getting sidetracked because I'm really passionate about this because it is one of the deepest, most idiotic parts of the truth movement that they never... I mean, there are actually fact-checked, questions on the Federal Reserve that tell you this is all untrue. I mean, they actually had to create a fact section, which means, questions, commonly asked questions, just to answer, because so many people were inquiring about all this fallacious information. Everything about it is untrue. Banks do not own the Federal Reserve. It's a creation of government. Does that mean that they don't write bills? Does that mean corporations don't write legislation and then wine and dine legislators and have them pass it? Absolutely. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that everything that comes from Congress is government. It's under Congress. Even the executive. But they're not going to do anything. They're organized criminals. They're like a board of directors. And they hire and can impeach or fire the president of the corporation. That's how much power Congress has. They can get rid of the president, just like every other corporation out there. Now, let's go back here. War and Emergency Powers, a special report on the national emergency in the United States of America. He starts out with a quote from James Madison that war should only be declared by the authority of the people whose toils and treasures are to support its burdens instead of the government, which is to reap its fruits, which is James Madison. So I took this and I shortened it a little and basically just want to read my version, if you will, that I was editing, just because it's the important parts without all the rhetoric and all the bad misspellings. But so I'll say it's edited, verified, updated, amended, and scripted for a film I was doing. This is actually a script I'm reading from. So, a national emergency. I called it back then, when I didn't really know so much, I called it the day the Constitution died. But that's pretty much every day, and as long as there's a national emergency. So, what is a national emergency as defined in Black's Law Dictionary, the first one? A state of national crisis, a situation demanding immediate and extraordinary national or federal action. Immediate and extraordinary, those are two very important words. Extraordinary. In other words, something above and beyond what is ordinary. Okay. Well, in Brown versus Bernstein, DCPA 49F Supplemental 728 and 732, Congress has made little or no distinction between a state of national emergency and a state of war. Again, Congress has made little or no distinction between a state of national emergency and a state of war. Look, whenever Congress wants something done, whenever these organized criminals want something done, they have this great, wonderful tool that they created where they don't have to create a state of war. They can just have their CEOs state that there's a state of national emergency. Just a simple declaration. And in that capacity, this is why we went to Vietnam. This is why we went to Korea. This is why Cuba still is what it is. You know, these are the reasons. Not because it's anything lawful or done by Congress, but because the president can declare a state of national emergency, which is pretty much equal to war. A war on the emergency. Let's declare a war. Now, this has been going on, again, since the Civil War, since what we read before. Now, I didn't read Lincoln's declaration, Lincoln's actual executive order, which was the initiation of the quote-unquote Civil War. Again, a war against an emergency. What was the emergency? That the South was stealing public lands by seceding. Okay, so got to keep the Union together. We discussed that last week. So, what do we got here? I'm just going to read now because this is such an interesting story, and this story is actually told by Congress. On November 19th, 1973, and keep in mind that these guys wrote this, Dr. Eugene Schroeder, etc., and company, wrote this in 1979. So these guys were way, way ahead of their time, man. I got to give them kudos, credit. On November 19th, 1973, a special committee of Congress was convened to review and decide upon the relevance of what it referred to as the declared national emergency. The name given to this special congressional committee was the, quote, Special Committee on the Termination of the National Emergency, unquote. That's Special Committee on the Termination of the National Emergency. You're welcome to look that up. Again, these are all searchable things. From the 93rd Congress, first session, in its Senate report number 93-549. That's 93rd Congress, first session, Senate report number 93-549. This is absolutely federal record, congressional record. This committee and its actions were recorded in the annals of U.S. congressional history by the United States Government Printing Office, Washington, D.C. This special committee report, the full title was, quote, Emergency Powers Statutes, Provisions of Federal Law Now in Effect, Delegating to the Executive Extraordinary Authority in Time of National Emergency, a report of the Special Committee on the Termination of the National Emergency, United States Senate, unquote. November 19th, 1973, U.S. Government Printing Office, Washington, 24-5090I, Special Committee on the Termination of the National Emergency, headed by Frank Church, the Idaho co-chairman. In the foreword of that report, these senators wrote the following, and this is kind of the all-telling thing that I really want you to get through your heads, folks. This is the foreword. Here's what it says. Now remember, I am reading from congressional record. I don't want you to think this is my opinion. I don't want you to think this is anything but the truth. This is what these people have left us. Quote, since March 9th, 1933, the United States has been in a state of declared national emergency. Let me repeat that. Since March 9th, 1933, the United States has been in a state of declared national emergency. In fact, there are now in effect 4 presidentially proclaimed states of national emergency. This is, of course, from 1979, or 1973. In addition to the national emergency declared by President Roosevelt in 1933, which we will certainly cover, there are also the national emergency proclaimed by President Truman on December 16, 1950, during the Korean conflict. Oh, not the Korean War? You mean it was a conflict? Oh, I see. So it had nothing to do with Congress. Oh, it wasn't a war. How many times do we have to say it? There are no wars anymore. There is just a big, ugly, mean corporation going around screwing with everybody. So the Korean conflict. See, I told you it wasn't a war. And the states of national emergency declared by President Nixon on March 23rd, 1970 and August 15th, 1971. I know one of those, I believe, has to do with Cuba. Quote, these proclamations give force to 470 provisions of federal law. In other words, when these executive orders are issued, they enact dead or laws, in other words, that are not in force in a time of quote-unquote peace, when there is no war against an emergency. So all of a sudden, all these laws, all these presidential directives, etc., all these things, they come to fruition because, hey, there's an emergency, quote-unquote war against the emergency, and therefore we're going to bring our arsenal out of laws that are not constitutional, not fair, not right, not lawful, completely de facto, absolutely illegitimate. These hundreds of statutes going on, quote, these hundreds of statutes delegate to the president extraordinary powers, that is, presidential directives and presidential executive orders, ordinarily exercised by the Congress, which affect the lives of American citizens in a host of all-encompassing manners. This vast range of powers, taken together, confer enough authority to rule the country without reference to normal constitutional processes. Now, I want to be clear. The Congress just told you that it is fully 100% aware that this vast range of powers taken together confer enough authority to rule the country without reference to normal constitutional processes. This is a report to decide whether to take away this power. They know about it, they're responsible for it, and yet they can use it as an excuse. Do you see how it works? This is the most brilliant organized crime in history. Quote, under the powers delegated by these statutes, the President, the Commander-in-Chief, may 1. Seize property. 2. Organize and control the means of production. 3. Seize commodities. 4. Assign military forces abroad. Like all 55 countries we've invaded, without a declaration or purpose, just the emergency. Number 5, institute martial law. You wonder where martial law comes from? This is where it comes from. All the president has to do, all the CEO has to do, is just declare an emergency. And as Congress just stated, we've been in a state of declared national emergency since March 9th, 1933. That has not changed. Okay, this is where all these documents come from. The one that came after 9/11, I can't even remember what it's called now. The Declaration of Emergency against the Swine Flu, etc., etc., etc. That is what all of these come from. And you know, every year, the president will redeclare the emergency to keep that power. Number 6, seize and control all transportation and communication. Gee, do you think that includes the internet, or are you one of those people that somehow thinks the internet is free? Seize all control and all transportation and communication. All right? Yeah, right. Number 7, regulate the operation of private enterprise. Well, shit, it's been doing that. It's been doing that since it came out with the CAFR. Restrict travel. Number 8. restrict travel. Have we seen a restriction on travel lately? Yes, I believe we have. And it says, quote, and in a plethora of particular ways, control the lives of all American citizens. Under the powers delegated by these statutes, the president may, in a plethora of particular ways, control the lives of all American citizens. Does that sound like what you were taught in school? Does that sound like the normal constitutional congressional process? No. Everything you've been taught is a freaking lie. You are under martial law. They call it military rule. And as long as you're at peace, as long as you're going along with it, as long as most people are absolutely oblivious to what I've talked about on all of these shows, including this, as long as people continue to use the currency of the United States in interstate commerce without even realizing they have a straw man, a persona, false status, without any clue that they've been sucked into this corporation and are not citizens of the states, but citizens of Washington, D.C. As soon as that happens, well, then the marshals of law would be declared, because then people might actually say, what the hell? How did this happen? Why am I cooperating? This isn't the way that America, quote-unquote, is supposed to be. Well, America hasn't been the way it's supposed to be since the first alteration of the Constitution, since the first alteration, since the Judicial Act of 1790. Folks, we got to wake up from this. With the melting of the Cold War, the developing detente with the Soviet Union and China, the stable truce of over 20 years' duration between North and South Korea, and the end of U.S. involvement in the war in Indochina, there is no present need for the United States government to continue to function under emergency conditions. Now, that is what they say, but in the end of the report, you find out they didn't change a damn thing, except maybe to make it a little harder. Well, you gotta redeclare the emergency every year for it to be valid. Oh, well, that didn't take away the emergency. You see, they know they have power to stop it, and they don't. It's their own special little corporation, their own special military, their own standing army. The very most important complaint against the King of England, right there. We might as well be right back where we started, under the King, under the boot. The Special Committee on the Termination of the National Emergency was created, one, to examine the consequences of terminating the declared states of national emergency that now prevail, to recommend what steps the Congress should take to ensure that the termination can be accomplished without adverse effect upon the necessary tasks of governing, and also to recommend ways in which the United States, the corporation, can meet future emergency situations with speed and effectiveness, but without relinquishment of congressional oversight and control. I repeat, but without relinquishment of congressional oversight and control. Congress is always on top, folks, no matter what they tell you, no matter how much they pretend that they don't have power. They can change the law at any time. Let's give you the example I was talking about. There's the full text of Obama's National Emergency Declaration. You're familiar with Trump's, of course. And you know, before the Trump presidency, before the election, I was very outspoken and said the only thing that this election should be about is ending this insanity that is the Declaration of National Emergency. That should be the only thing that people talk about. This is the only thing that you should be forcing your congressmen to do so that all the excuses they use can no longer be used. But no, I'm just a small fish, remember? The White House, Office of Press Secretary for Immediate Release, October 24, 2009, declaration of a national emergency with respect to the 2009 H1N1 influenza pandemic, the non-starter, by the President of the United States of America, a proclamation. And here's how they go. On April 26, 2009, the Secretary of Health and Human Services, the Secretary, first declared a public health emergency under Section 319 of the Public Health Service Act, 42 U.S. Code 247D, in response to the 2009 H1N1 influenza virus. The Secretary has renewed that declaration twice, on July 24th, 2009, and October 1st, 2009. In addition, by rapidly identifying the virus, implementing public health measures, providing guidance for health professionals and the general public, and developing an effective vaccine. Effective vaccine. Oh, yes. Yes, an effective vaccine. Can you prove that? No. We have taken proactive steps to reduce the impact of the pandemic and protect the health of our citizens. As a nation, we have prepared at all levels of government and as individuals and communities, taking unprecedented steps to counter the emerging pandemic. Now, Patrick Jordan would tell you, and he'd be absolutely right, that anybody who doesn't understand that vaccines have been and always are and always have been biological weapons, a corruption of the blood, to cause immediate and slow virus type of disease. Anyone who cannot figure out that these are biological weapons must be absolutely brainwashed or completely insane. How do you know what? I'm just going to refer you to my documentary, which I did in 2010, 2011 maybe. It's called Lethal Injection, The Story of Vaccination. If you haven't seen that, you can go to thecorporationnation.com. You can watch it for free. I don't sell it. It's never been for sale. I've never sold anything, ever. It's on YouTube. It's been copied and recopied at my request. It's been seen, I believe, over 100,000 times, but I can't, how do you keep track of something like that? It's also available at Dollar DVD Project, where you pay $2 and you get a copy. I allow him to do that because it's nonprofit. And it's always going to be nonprofit. It's always going to be there for posterity. And, anyway, to understand the importance of this declaration of emergency, to understand the laws that come into place during an emergency like this, you should watch my documentary, because it covers all of the different ways now they can force vaccinate, they can force this, they can quarantine, they can do all kinds, they can round y'all up. Because, why? Because there's a war against the H1N1 influenza pandemic, or whatever other disease they declare, that they create, and then they declare an emergency. Nevertheless, the 2009 H1N1 pandemic continues to evolve. Oh, does it? What, in your labs, you mean? Yeah, I'd say that's true. The rates of illness continue to rise rapidly with many communities across the nation. It's not true. And the potential exists for a pandemic to overburden health care resources in some localities. Thus, in recognition of the continuing progression of the pandemic and in further preparation as a nation, we are taking additional steps to facilitate our response. In other words, we're going to throw on our dictator hat, declare an emergency. Now, therefore, I, Barack Obama, a false name, President of the United States of America, by virtue of the authority vested me in the Constitution, by the Constitution, and the laws of the United States, including Sections 201 and 301 of the National Emergencies Act. Oh, who passed that? Congress. 50 U.S. Code 1601. And consistent with Section 1135 of the Social Security Act, SSA, as amended, 42 U.S. Code 1320B-5. Who passed that? Oh, yeah, Congress. Do hereby find and proclaim that, given that the rapid increase in illness across the nation may overburden healthcare resources, and that the temporary waiver of certain standard federal requirements may be warranted in order to enable U.S. healthcare facilities to implement emergency operations plans. The 2009 H1N1 influenza pandemic in the United States constitutes a national emergency. Accordingly, I hereby declare that the Secretary may exercise the authority under Section 1135 of the Social Security Act to temporarily waive or modify certain requirements of the Medicare, Medicaid, and state children's health insurance programs and of the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act privacy rule, all passed by Congress, throughout the duration of the public health emergency declared in response to the 2009 H1N1 influenza pandemic. Excuse me? You're just arbitrarily saying these laws don't exist anymore? You're just arbitrarily saying, yeah, we're not gonna follow that. We're gonna temporarily waive or modify certain requirements and say they're void. Sorry, it's an emergency. That goes with everything. Every law can be nullified by this. You got to understand that. And the Constitution, as Congress just told you, is basically dead. In exercising this authority, the Secretary shall provide certification and advance written notice to the Congress, as required by Section 1135D of the Social Security Act, 42 U.S. Code 1328B-5. Who passed that? Oh, that's right, Congress. In witness thereof, I hereunto set my hand, etc., etc., etc. Now, that is just one example where they give the reasons and then, of course, proclaim the emergency. They're a dime a dozen. You can search all the national emergencies, etc. But what you really need to know, again, what was that list, folks? Remember that list of things? Okay, anytime the national emergency can be declared, and under those powers delegated by these statutes, the president may seize property, organize and control the means of production, seize commodities, assign military forces abroad, institute martial law, seize and control all transportation and communication, regulate the operation of private enterprise, restrict travel, and in a plethora of particular ways control the lives of all American citizens. That's you. But we're a free country. God damned, I love my country. Really? You still patriotic, huh? I still can't get that out of you. Okay, well, we'll continue. Charles E. Hughes, Supreme Court Justice of 1920, from the book Constitutional Development by Carl Brent Swisher. He said, quote, "We may well wonder, in view of the precedents now established, whether constitutional government, as heretofore maintained in this republic, could survive another great war, even victoriously waged. The conflict known as the World War has ended as far as military hostilities were concerned, but was not yet officially terminated. Most of the war statutes were still in effect. Many of the emergency organizations were still in operations. So the war ends, but the emergencies stay. All the statutes, see, that's the problem. They say, well, no, we're just going to do this temporarily. Just a temporary change because we have an imminent threat, an imminent emergency. Terrorists are going to get us. Oh, my God. And then they never change. They never get rid of them. They just keep them there because it's convenient. It gives you power you don't otherwise have. Does Congress do anything about it? No, because they're behind it. There is no competition in government. It's all a fucking show. It's a reality show. What is this man talking about, though, when he speaks of the war statutes in effect and the emergency organizations still in operation? The winner of a war would, in the end, be a stronger nation, right? How can a war end but at the same time not be terminated? Wait, Oh, that's strange, isn't it? And why would war statutes or military rule, as I try to tell you, you're under, remain in effect after the war has ended? Just why would they do that? Well, again, it's convenient. I mean, if you're the mafia and you have control of the laws, you suspend them at your behest, right? You get your CEO, your big boss to do it. Well, let's go back to 1933, right? Because that's when the Congress has told us in their the Senate has told us in their report that we've been under this and that the Constitution has been suspended. So let's talk about it. In 1933, the House passed the Farm Bill by a vote of more than 3-1. So here again, we see the doctrine of emergency. Once an emergency is declared, there is no Constitution. Or, if there is, it's just bypassable. And every law is bypassable. Quote, this is from Congressman James M. Beck, speaking in 1933 from the Congressional Record, where he stated, quote, I think of all the damnable heresies that have ever been suggested in connection with the Constitution, the doctrine of emergency is the worst. It means that when Congress declares an emergency, there is no Constitution. This means it's death. It is the very doctrine that the German Chancellor is invoking today in the dying hours of the parliamentary body of the German Republic, namely that because of an emergency, it should grant to the German Chancellor absolute power to pass any law, even though the law contradicts the Constitution of the German Republic. Chancellor Hitler is at least frank about it. We pay the Constitution lip service, but the result is the same. But the Constitution of the United States, as a restraining influence in keeping the federal government within the carefully prescribed channels of power, is moribund, if not dead. We are witnessing its death agonies. For when this bill, speaking of the Farm Bill, in 1933, for when this bill becomes a law, if unhappily it becomes a law, there is no longer any workable Constitution to keep the Congress within the limits of its constitutional powers. Did he say president? Unquote, by the way. Did he say president? Did he say keep the executive? No, he said keep Congress within its limits of constitutional powers. You see, he knows where the power lies. Again, that's Congressman James M. Beck speaking in 1933 on the Congressional Record. The cause and effect of the doctrine of emergency is the subject of this report. Now again, since March the 9th, 1933, the United States has been in a state of declared national emergency. That's the first sentence of that Senate report, 93-549 from the year 1973. Congressman James M. Beck, speaking in 1933, again, he says it again. This vast range of powers taken together confer enough authority to rule the country without reference to normal constitutional processes. And he goes on, seize property, organize and control the means of production, seize commodities, assign military forces abroad, institute martial law, seize and control all transportation and communication, regulate the operation of private enterprise, restrict travel, and control the lives of all American citizens. He repeats it in the record. From Senate Report 93-549, in the introduction section again, the same report, quote, a majority of the people of the United States have lived all their lives under emergency rule. Remember, Trump just declared a bunch of emergencies. For 40 years, freedoms and governmental procedures guaranteed by the Constitution have, in varying degrees, been abridged by laws brought into force by states of a national emergency. Those laws don't have effect unless there's an emergency. Quote, and in the United States, actions taken by the government in times of great crisis have, from at least the Civil War, as we discussed, in important ways shaped the present phenomenon of a permanent state of national emergency. Okay, this is a permanent state of war. which grants war powers, right? That was the name of this, war and emergency powers. Those don't exist unless there is a declared war or emergency. You understand? That is what we live under. That is why things are the way they are. And we go along with it. Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution of the United States of America says that the writ of habeas corpus shall not be suspended unless, when in cases of rebellion or invasion, the public safety may require it. And this is why Lincoln, of course, suspended habeas corpus during the Civil War, and why it will be suspended whenever you seek it. Because we're in a permanent state of national emergency. It can be taken away at any time. And that probably, I'm just guessing, that probably includes on an individual basis. I would assume that's why we torture people, and why we keep people in prisons, and why we do all these horrible, horrible things. Well, when I say we, I certainly don't mean me. I'm just a silent partner. I just reap the benefits. I'm just as bad as anybody else. It is important to note here that the popular catchphrase with regard to the public perception of the writ of habeas corpus, based on this constitutional reference, is to call it the right of habeas corpus. And yet, as we can plainly read in Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution, habeas corpus is most definitely listed as a privilege that can be taken away under declared emergency or invasion, right? So, you got to realize, folks, when you're reading the Constitution, most people have not read the Constitution. And when I say that, I mean they haven't taken into consideration words like unless or except. Because everything they say that sounds so frickin' wonderful always has an exception clause, always says unless. You see, it's not a permanent thing. Except, unless, right? If I say that I'm going to give you $1 million, and then I say except or unless this happens, or unless I decide not to, or unless I declare an emergency, it doesn't mean anything. This is how it was written, folks. This was not accidental. What was the Civil War? Rebellion, right? They called it a rebellion. It wasn't, but that's what they called it. Insurrection, as we talked about. Of course, if they're going to suspend it. Anyone who goes against the tyrant, anyone who goes against the kingdom, and its king, and its board of directors, Congress, they're going to suspend it. How can you sit there and tell me you are free? You are not. You're under a state of emergency, of war. You are literally under the war doctrine, and the Lieber Code applies, which we'll get to. I'm sorry, am I bursting your bubble? Are you going to argue with me? Are you going to go against this congressional report? I welcome you to, because, it just shows how fallacious we've become. The truth doesn't matter. Just give me my hamburgers, my HGTV, my MTV, and my cheap Chinese-made shit, and I'll be happy. Habeas corpus is the great writ of liberty. This is the writ that guarantees that the government cannot charge us, the quote-unquote people that we think we are, with and hold us for any crime unless they follow the procedure of due process of law. This writ also says, in effect, that the privilege of due process of law cannot be suspended, and that the government cannot operate its arbitrary prerogative power against, quote-unquote, we the people. But once again, we see that great writ of liberty, that patriotic notion of it, in fact, under the Constitution's authority, can be suspended when an invasion, a rebellion, or a perceived threat to the continuity of that corporation, that government, is, the interpretive phrase public safety necessitates it. The important thing about necessity is that necessity knows no law. Now, why do you think, as we read, that the United States ensured after the Civil War that the Constitution and the laws of the United States are the preeminent supreme law of the land. Do you know, if you look up the word law of the land, folks, do you know what it actually means? Nothing more, nothing less than due process of law. Law of the land and due process of law are the same thing. It's another bullshit propaganda thing. Sounds romantic, but all it is the court system, which is completely corrupt. And it can be suspended. Okay, so habeas corpus can be suspended because due process of law can be suspended. Why would you put due process of law? Oh, I get it. Because you can then suspend it anytime you want to. And because due process of law, i.e. law of the land, is, in fact, the supreme law, that means that you have to accept the fact that it's suspended. Pretty brilliant. I mean, this is the underbelly, the underpinnings of organized crime right here. This is it. This is the Admiralty International Law Pirate Cove right here being dissected right in front of your eyes. I guess your ears. This, according to the very Constitution we hold so dear. Now, this is one of my favorite. The Fifth Amendment is the most ridiculous freaking thing I've ever heard in my life. You want to see, again, I don't think people have actually, maybe they just skip over these words, right? These exception clauses. I don't know. But let's read the Fifth Amendment. Fifth Amendment says no person shall be, no person, no, not a man, but a person. No person shall be held to answer for a capital or otherwise infamous crime unless, unless, well, it sounded so good until you said that. No person shall be held for to answer for a capital or otherwise infamous crime, this is habeas corpus, unless on presentment or indictment of a grand jury, and except, what? In cases arising in the land or naval forces or in the militia when in active service in time of war or public danger. Oh, there it is. Public safety necessitates it, and necessity knows no law. That's the maxim. When in actual service in time of war or public danger. So essentially, why didn't they just say all persons shall be held to answer for a capital? Why not just tell the truth? Well, they can't do that. They have to make it sound romantic. Nor shall any person be subject for the same offense to be twice put in jeopardy of life or limb, nor shall be compelled in any criminal case to be witness against himself, nor be deprived of life, liberty, or property without wait, there's an exception again, without due process of law, nor shall private property be taken for public use without except when we give you just compensation. So they just told you all these things don't count except or without due process of law. But due process of law, the law of the land, can be suspended with a national emergency. And we have been in a freaking national emergency, a permanent state of national emergency, according to Congress, since 1933. Are you going to sit there and tell me that due process exists? Well, you think your life, liberty, and property can't be taken without due process? You think your property can't be taken without just compensation? Then you're a fool. You're a fool. We're all fools. We've all been raised to be fools. That is what public-mindedness is. That's what public education does. You see, everybody quotes the Fifth Amendment. Oh, my life and my liberty, my property. Oh. First of all, it says person, not man. It's not your property because you are a person of the United States, and the person, which is a status, belongs to the United States, so it's not your property, it's your person's. And it's not your person, it's the United States. So the whole thing is just whitewash. It's doublespeak. We're just back to doublespeak. Oh, but those brave founding fathers, they sure... No, they didn't. They gave themselves an out, just like all Congress has ever done. This is just a continuation of that Congress, that Continental Congress. It's no different. Except, unless, without. Except, without, unless. Come on! We can see here that the framers of the Constitution were already contemplating times when there would be conditions under which it might be necessary to suspend the guarantees of the Constitution before the country was even born. These clauses, like except and without and unless, change what might otherwise be this brilliant Constitution we all pretend it is, and the Declaration of Independence. And it changes it into a nightmarish entrapment of government and executive tyranny. Well, you have that right if we tell you you have that right. We have that privilege as long as we keep it, as long as we don't declare it void, as long as we don't say, screw the Constitution, which they did, and have been doing since 1933. The Senate Report 93-549, again referring to the emergency powers. They are quite careful and restrictive on the power, but the power to suspend is specifically contemplated by the Constitution in the writ of habeas corpus. The concept of a constitutional dictatorship, folks. The concept of the constitutional dictatorship, folks, goes clear back to the Roman Republic, circa 508 BC. And this is not something new. We're under the Roman law. We're in a new fangled feudal system. Nothing has changed. And there it was determined that in times of dire emergencies, the Constitution and the rights of the people could be suspended temporarily until the crisis could be resolved, whatever its nature. But once the crisis was resolved, the Constitution was properly to be returned to its peacetime position of authority over the temporary authority and emergency powers of the aristocracy. Checks and balances would be restored. We haven't had checks and balances for... not in our lifetimes, folks. Now, listen to this, because, again, our Constitution is not unique. In fact, George Washington, when he was talking about the Constitution, said it was, and the Declaration of Independence, said it was simply the opinion at the time, world opinion, the world stage. That's all it was. There was nothing original. There was nothing new. It was just what was at the time. It was not what you think it was. It was not new. In France, the situation under which the Constitution could be suspended is called a state of siege. Do you know that? In Great Britain, the Queen, right? She can suspend the Constitution. It's called, you can look it up, it's called the Defense of the Realms Act. In Germany, in which Hitler became a dictator, he used what was called Article 48. When you say, or when you allow the media to compare our president to, say, Hitler or someone else, no matter what you know or don't know about Hitler, you got to realize that it's a true statement. Because at any time, the president could do exactly what Hitler did. Whether it was good or bad, that's your thing. Again, Article 48 of the Constitution, here's what it says, or said. Quote, if the public safety and order in the German Reich are seriously disturbed or endangered, the President of the Reich may suspend in whole or in part the fundamental rights established, including inviolability of person, inviolability of domicile. Okay, same thing. Freedom of opinion and expression can be squashed. Freedom of assembly and association, squashed. Secrecy in communication and inviolability of property. Gee, does that sound familiar? Communication, assembly, association, property. It's the same thing. In the United States, it is called the War Powers. And with it, the War Powers Acts. So the question becomes, is the United States under emergency war powers? Because that Senate report was, hey, that was back in 1973? So is the United States still under emergency war powers? Did you not notice that I just read Obama's... Do you think Obama would have the power to declare a national emergency if the War Powers Act still weren't in effect? Do you think Trump could do the same? If the War Powers Act weren't in the same, if Congress wasn't in collusion through its corporation to do this? Of course we're in. Of course we're in it. To answer that question, we should be able to go to the federal code, known as the U.S. Code, or United States Code, right? USC. And find the statute, the congressionally approved statutory law that verifies that, yes, we're under emergency war powers. Now, if we went to the library today and picked up a copy of 12 U.S. Code and went to section 95B, we'll find just such a law. And here's what it says. Quote, the actions, regulations, rules, licenses, orders, and proclamations heretofore or hereafter taken, promulgated, made, or issued by the President of the United States or the Secretary of the Treasury since March the 4th, 1933, pursuant to the amended 12 U.S. Code, Section 95A, are hereby approved and confirmed. March 9th, 1933, C1, Title 1, Section 148, Statute 1. Now, let's pick that apart, folks, because are you realizing what that says? The President of the United States or the Secretary of the Treasury since 1933, Congress says that the actions, regulations, rules, licenses, orders, and proclamations heretofore or hereafter, that means before today and after today, okay, taken, promulgated, or made, issued by the President, are approved and confirmed. They're pre-approved. Do you understand? Congress just made an act that said whatever the President does, or whatever the Secretary of Treasury does, not only from here, but retroactively from 1933, March the 4th, all the way to the future, without end, are approved and confirmed. Okay, this is very important because this is what allows the national emergency to be declared, the presidential directive to be declared. It allows all the crap we're suffering today. And it allows Congress to sit back and watch the shitstorm happen without any... Well, of course, they pretend not to have any responsibility, but you go look at this, folks. Nothing could be more unsettling to me than this particular part of U.S. Code, which says that everything the President does heretofore and hereafter are automatically approved and confirmed. Why do you think the President seems to be this rogue agent that can do anything he wants? And why do you think Congress says, oh my God, we can't do anything about this President? Oh my God. It's all a lie. And this proves it. This proves that this is a Hollywood production. Congress is there for show. Right? I mean, they just assigned all their power. Everything they create is created into the executive branch, the military arm. It's all illusion. Simply translated, this means that everything the President or the Secretary of the Treasury has done since March the 4th, 1933, or heretofore, or anything that the President or Secretary of the Treasury is hereafter going to do, i.e. hereafter, is automatically approved and confirmed. Now remember, according to the Congressional Record of 1973 and Senate Report 93549, The United States has been in a state of national emergency since 1933. This means that U.S. Code, Title 12, Section 95B, is current law. This is the law that exists over this United States right at this moment, today. Oh, look at there. I wrote this in 2012. Well, that's how old this is. That's how long ago I read this. Today in 2012. And they probably got this in 2011. Holy crap. Look how far we've come. If this is the case, if this is current law, let's make sure we understand what is being said here. Since every action, rule, or law put into effect by the President or by the Secretary of Treasury since that time and into the future will be confirmed and approved, let us determine the significance of that particular date in history. What the hell happened on March the 4th of 1933? What happened? Why did this happen? What was so special about March the 4th, 1933? Well, not so coincidentally. It turns out that one Franklin Delano Roosevelt was inaugurated as President of the United States on March the 4th, 1933. Yeah, remember, it's a family affair here, folks. Remember that the Congress, the mainstream, I can't remember who did it, but he showed that 49 members of Congress are Barack Obama's cousins, and he was going to prove, and he knew already, but he was going to show through his genealogical research that every single congressman was a cousin of, or every single senator, was a cousin of Barack Obama. And of course, this is true. This is how it works, folks. Remember, it's them and their posterity. It's a bloodline. It's a family affair. It's them and their posterity. Remember, Obama is a direct descendant of the kings of England. Direct. First cousins with Anne Boleyn. So, let's hear what our newly elected president had to say, this Franklin Delano Roosevelt had to say during his inaugural address. So elegantly stated during one of the worst eras in our country's fabled history, which we call the Great Depression, right? He says, quote, and this is March the 4th, the day that Congress labels as that special day. Why? Well, President Roosevelt, in his inaugural address, so he's just elected, man, he's just stepping up there. He says, quote, I am prepared under my constitutional duty to recommend the measures that a stricken nation in the midst of a stricken world may require. Oh, so romantic. These measures, or such other measures as the Congress may build out of its experience and wisdom, I shall seek within my constitutional authority to bring to speedy adoption. But in the event that the Congress shall fail to take one of these two courses, and in the event that the national emergency is still critical, again, and in the event that the national emergency is still critical, in other words, it hasn't been declared yet, I shall not evade the clear course of duty that will then confront me, i.e., I shall become a dictator. I shall ask the Congress for the one remaining instrument to meet the crisis, broad executive power to wage a war against the emergency, as great as the power that would be given to me if we were, in fact, invaded by a foreign foe. Unquote. Now remember, what did Congress decide? Congress said that there is no difference, or no distinguishable difference, between a declaration or a state of war and a state of national emergency. This is what he's telling you, that he's admitting that he's telling you how much power he has right here just by he's not declaring a war, he's declaring, as he said, a war against an emergency. It's ridiculous. So Roosevelt was going to ask Congress for the extraordinary authority available to him under the War Powers Act. Did he get it? Well, I mean, according to the last code we read, apparently so, but let's see what happened here. On March 5th, the next day, 1933, I mean, this guy's been in office one day. His second day as President of the United States, Franklin Roosevelt asked for a special and extraordinary session of Congress through proclamation number 2038. You can look that up for yourself. He called for a special session of Congress to meet on the March 9th, 1933 at noontime. And at the congressional session, he presented an act, a bill, to provide relief for the, quote, existing national emergency in banking and for other purposes. In the enabling portion of that act, it states, quote, be it enacted by the Senate and the House of Representatives of the United States of America and in Congress assembled, that the Congress hereby declares that a serious emergency exists, and that it is imperatively necessary, speedily, to put into effect remedies of uniform national application. That is not so different from what was declared with the Civil War, to be quite frank, just worded differently. Now, here's another jumble of words that we got to break apart. The phrase imperatively necessary and speedily can be translated into what is known as the rule of necessity. Again, the rule of necessity states that necessity knows no law. Okay, so this just basically means we don't need to vote, we don't need Congress, the president can do whatever the hell he wants. And that is why, since March 4th, 1933, this report states that we've been under a permanent state of national emergency. Again, folks, this is your true history, the true history of the quote-unquote United States. Throw all this other shit that you hear away. This is your reality. The rule of necessity overrides all other law and allows the individual or the governing body the power or right to commit acts which otherwise would be against common or constitutional law. For instance, murder is unlawful except in the case of necessity, which some people would call self-defense. Right? It's necessary. You got to defend yourself. It's a well-known thing. It's just we didn't know it was happening like this. The law of necessity states that another life can be taken to protect your own. In this case, kill or be killed. That is more of a natural law than anything. Since the newly elected president was enacting or enabling the rule of necessity in this Proclamation 2038, ultimately seeking broad executive powers, or what could be called a constitutional executive dictatorship, if I were to name it, free of the constraints of constitutional checks and balances, free of Congress, or, for that matter, the Constitution itself, the logical conclusion we could make is that the newly elected president would follow up this request to the Congress for complete and totalitarian power over the United States government and the people within it, and something that is constitutionally unlawful, something that is not allowed by the Constitution itself, except unless there's an emergency declared. So brilliant. I mean, in other words, there is no Constitution. If something can be suspended at a whim, it doesn't really count. It's just for show. The Act of March 9th, 1933 states the following. The actions, regulations, rules, licenses, orders, and proclamations heretofore and hereafter taken, promulgated, made, or issued by the President of the United States or the Secretary of Treasury since March the 4th, 1933, pursuant to the authority conferred by Subdivision B of Section 5 of the Act of October 6, 1917, as amended, are hereby approved and confirmed. That's almost exactly like the previous and still law, that law we just read above, which was U.S. Code, Title 12, Section 95B. Same thing. That's how long it's been in power. So it sounds like he got his wishes and passed that power on to every new president. Congress never took it away. Congress, what did we say before? These are supposed to go away in times of peace, right? But you see, we don't have peace. We always have an emergency. We always are in a state of war against the emergency. Biggest scam in our history, right here. So again, where have we read those words before? Oh yeah, that's right, our current U.S. Code, Title 12, USC 95B. Nothing's changed. The language in Title 12 is exactly the same as found in the Act of March 9th, 1933, Chapter 1, Title 1, Section 48, Statute 1. Therefore, the Act of March 9th, 1933 is still in full force and effect today as federal law. We are still under the rule of necessity. Remember, necessity knows no law. And this is why everything seems so crazy, so out of control. These guys are just rogue. We are still in a declared state of national emergency, a state of emergency that has existed uninterrupted since 1933 for over, how many years is that, 80 years? The Constitution is and has been for over 70, 80-something years, suspended until further notice. The glass has been broken and the emergency has existed since then. But where did the authority to do this come from? Did it come from the Constitution? Well, yeah, we said it came from the war powers, right? Surely the Constitution protects we the people from such political coups and takeovers. Surely our blessed, loving founding fathers wouldn't leave us with a big kick in the ass like this, right? Oh, the mythological misconceptions of the Holy Constitution strike again! The cult of the Constitution must die! By the year 1917, the United States was already heavily involved in World War I. At that point, it was recognized that there were out there enemies of the United States, or at least allies of these enemies of the United States, living within the continental borders of our nation in that time of war. All you have to do is look at the Chinese or the Japanese internments, and this is this is factual information. What happened to them can easily happen to all of us. Therefore, Congress passed the Act of October 6, 1917, which identified who could be declared enemies of the United States. You think, I'm sure, that you're a friend of the United States. In this act, though, Congress gave the government total authority over those enemies to do with them as they saw fit. But who is the enemies? We also see, however, in Section 2, Subdivision C, that this applies to other than citizens of the United States. This is back in 1917. All right, so the Act of 1917, October 6, 1917, declared who the enemies of the United States were, and it declared that they were other than citizens of the United States. Okay. Well, did that change, or is that still the way it is? Because how many times have I told you, you are all enemies of the United States? It's just potential. You can declare you an enemy at any time, therefore you are again, it's the exception, right? It's the exception clause. If you can be declared an enemy at the drop of a hat without any rhyme or reason, and Congress will approve that, well, then you're already an enemy. There's no protection. It's all fake. It's a facade. The Act specifically excluded citizens of the United States. Of course, it was only reasonable to consider in 1917 that the citizens of the United States were not enemies. And so we, the people, were excluded from these war powers over the definition of enemies in this act. But with all such congressional acts and bills, the power of the amendment is a constant threat to the constitutional law and freedom. If you folks understood, if you would ever read one of these congressional bills, these omnibus bills, it's like 50,000 different laws being changed all in one bill. All they have to do is change one word and the entirety of the law changes. You got to understand that when they create a law, they're not creating it to be a set law. They're creating it so they can change it later. By changing one word, they change the entire meaning and structure of the law. All right? This is why you don't want a Congress that is passing laws every freaking day. If at all, there should be 2 or 3 laws passed a year. But you've got a Congress that that's all they do is pass law, pass statutes, pass this. That's ridiculous. That's not what it's supposed to be. Section 5B of the Act of October 6, 1917, here's what it states. That the President may investigate, regulate, or prohibit under such rules and regulations as he may prescribe, by means of licenses or otherwise, any transaction in foreign exchange, export or earmarkings of gold and silver coin or bullion or currency. We remember that. Confiscations. Transfers of credit in any form other than credits relating solely to transactions to be executed wholly within the United States. All right, so again, enemies were considered as foreign. If the president did not have the power to arbitrarily do those things, prescribe, license, otherwise, transactions that were wholly within the United States. So obviously, only foreigners were considered enemies of the United States. We see here that citizens, the transaction of these domestic citizens made wholly within the United States were specifically excluded from the war powers of this act in 1917, that is. But remember the amendment process. It can change anything at any time. We the people. I'm going to stop saying that. I didn't realize that we weren't the people back then. So we common denizens, citizenships of the United States, we who act in the person status of the United States person, were not declared enemies of our country in this particular act, in the origin. Therefore, the government did not have total authority over us as they were given over our foreign enemies. In a nutshell, this act did not apply to us unless we traded with the enemy, defined in the acts as other than citizens of the United States. Commerce between U.S. citizens did not fall under the laws created by this act. This is very important because it's about to change. It's important to draw attention again to the fact that the citizens of the United States in October 1917 were not called enemies. Consequently, the government, under the war powers of this act, the laws that went into effect because of this act, the war powers that went into effect because of this emergency, essentially, the banking emergency, they did not have authority over the citizens in the United States, only foreigners. We were still protected by the Constitution. Let me rephrase that again, too, because now I understand there is no Constitution when it comes to public citizens, U.S. citizens. That only protects people who aren't U.S. citizens, the private people, we the people, which aren't we. In other words, the Constitution still limited the president from, in times of peace, from, yeah, you get the idea. Didn't actually protect us, it just limited the president. But to the foreign enemies of this nation, the government was empowered to do anything it deemed necessary. The distinction made between enemies of the United States and citizens of the United States will become very clear. Where did the authority to declare a national emergency and grant rule of necessity, dictatorial war powers come from? Let's go back. Let's take a look at the Act of March 9th, 1933, Section 2 of this Act, Subdivision B of Section 5, the Act of October 6, 1917, as amended, is hereby amended to read as follows. Now, note that this is the language that was used to amend Section 5B of the Act of October 6, which we were just talking about. This Trading with the Enemies Act. Replacing it with the new word or phrases in quotes to completely change the meaning and interpretation of the original act of 1917. This is done all the time. throughout history and more than ever in today's Congress, and can quickly and easily turn a harmless constitutional bill or law into a tyrannical and fascist corporate code with the click of a presidential pen. So let's see how the Act of October 6, 1917, which said that U.S. citizens could not be considered enemies, let's see how it reads after it's amended by the Act of March 9th, 1933. The amended version, Section 5B, reads as follows. Let's see how it changes here. During the time of war or during any other period of national emergency declared by the President, which, this is March 9th. That happened March 5th. This is 4 days later. During the time of war, they knew what they were doing. During time of war, during any period of national emergency declared by the President may, through any agency that he may designate, whoa, that changed, or otherwise investigate, regulate, or prohibit, under such rules and regulations as he may prescribe by means of licenses, or otherwise, any transactions in foreign exchange, transfers of credit between, or payments by banking institutions, as defined by the President, and export, hoarding, melting, or earmarking of gold or silver coin, bullion, or currency, by any person within the United States or any place subject to the jurisdiction of. Whoa! Whoa! Wait a minute! What just happened here? As far as commercial, monetary, or business transaction was concerned, the people of the United States, common citizens, were no longer differentiated from any other enemy, any other foreigner of the United States, foreign or domestic. We just lost that crucial distinction between being a friendly citizen, a peaceful citizen, and being the enemy of the United States government. Comparing the two acts, we can see that the phrase which excluded transactions executed wholly within the United States has been removed. Where did it go? Remember the previous one said only foreign transactions. Well, now it's gone. It's no longer there. They just arbitrarily said, yeah, let's get rid of that. So it's been removed from the original version of Section 5B of the Act of October 6, 1917, Section 2, and replaced with, by any person within the United States or any place subject to the jurisdiction thereof. That means the 50 states in the Act of March 9th, 1933. Right? So let's refresh here. Roosevelt comes along first day after his inauguration, says, I'm going to do some horrible things. I'm going to declare a national emergency. I expect Congress to support me. Congress then says, hey, yeah, everything you do from now on is approved. Go ahead. Yeah, it's all fine. That has not changed. And then they come together 5 days later and they say, let's just completely screw the American people and say that they're all enemies or potential enemies, any person within the United States. Let's just completely this was like this is a coup. This is a takeover, folks. This is Congress allowing its holding corporation, its militarized force, to take complete control of everything and everyone in a plethora of many ways. Remember, every person that is subject to the president's opinion. When it says any person, that means potentially. So that means that we're all, again, if you can be called an enemy in the Trading with the Enemies Act, well then, if you're eligible to be called an enemy, then you have no actual protection. You see, you every one of these rights, privileges, protections, safety guarantees, they all have an exception clause. So none of them actually count. All monetary transactions, whether domestic or international in scope, were now placed at the whim of the President of the United States through the authority given to him by the now amended Trading with the Enemy Act to personally decide whether these transactions are by a friend or a foe. So he just became judge and executioner, basically. To summarize, well, of course he has a whole staff to do that. To summarize this critical point, on October the 6th of 1917, at the beginning of America's involvement in World War I, Congress passed a Trading with the Enemy Act, empowering the government to take control over any and all commercial, monetary, and business transactions conducted by enemies or allies of enemies within our continental borders. That act also defined the term enemy and excluded from that definition citizens of the United States. This could be considered a logical and reasonable defensive measure when considering our wartime efforts. I don't have any problem with that, but see, I'm smart enough. I've had enough experience reading bills to know that they can change it at any time. So any bill I read that sounds good, I always look at it and say, what word could they change? What definition could they change? What could they say here to make this the most horrific bill possible? And you know what? Every bill they pass, every one of them, if you just think, well, what could they do to this bill? What could they do to this law to make it completely opposite? That's what you should be doing when you read the law. All the potentials, all the possibilities, because there is nothing set in stone. In Section 5B of this Act of October 6, 1917, we see that credits relating solely to transactions executed wholly within the United States were excluded from that controlling authority of the President, as transactions wholly domestic in nature were excluded from his authority, and so the government had no extraordinary control over the daily business conducted by the citizens of the United States, because we were not enemies of the state. Or potential ones. Again, this seems a reasonable constitutional reaction to a wartime setting. But in looking again at Section 2 of the Act of March 9th, 1933, we can see that the phrase excluding wholly domestic transactions has been removed. Removed from the amended version and replaced with by any person within the United States or any place subject to the jurisdiction thereof. That's really, I mean, if you think about it, folks, that's not really much different than what Hitler did. Right? Papers, please. Right? I mean, this is not any different than what Hitler did when he enacted Article 48, I believe it was. The people of the United States are now subject, that's people uncapitalized, that's us, the common folks, we're now subject to the power of the Trading with the Enemy Act of October 6, 1917, as amended by this new act, for the purposes of all commercial, monetary, and in effect all business transactions, we became the same as the enemy, and are now afforded no constitutional protections. The distinction between enemy and citizen was effectively erased. It is important to note here that in the acts of October 6, 1917 and March 9th, 1933, it states, during times of war or during any other national emergency declared by the President. You see, they had to throw that in there. They had to throw that in there because otherwise this couldn't have happened. You can't declare war against your own people. Are you starting to understand that? That's why there was no Civil War. I can't remember who said this quote, but the Civil War, it's a very simple quote. A civil war is a war of words. And that is a true statement. That's really what it's a war of words. And we're seeing how those words were altered and magically disappeared and recreated into a tyrant's wet dream. The only difference is that our tyrant is a corporation with a board of directors called Congress. You know, it's e pluribus unum, out of many one. Yeah, so they're like joint holders. So we can now read that the war powers enabled in these acts not only included a period of war, but also a period of national emergency as defined and declared by the President of the United States. So, I mean, that's just arbitrary will, so it can happen anytime, is what they're saying. You can be an enemy, declared an enemy anytime, you have no control, you don't have to do anything. It's just, when either of these two situations occurs, the President may, quote, through any agency that he may designate or otherwise investigate, regulate, or prohibit, under such rules and regulations as he may prescribe, by means of licenses or otherwise, any transactions in foreign exchange, transfer of credit between, or payments by banking institutions as defined by the President, and export, hoarding, melting, earmarking of gold or silver coin or bullion or currency by any person within the United States or any place subject to the jurisdiction thereof. Now, why, folks? Why, oh why, do you think gold was confiscated? Because they can. They passed a law and said he could do it right there. You just heard it. Who defines what hoarding or melting or earmarking of gold is? Why, the President does. So if you have one frickin' coin, you could be a hoarder. What can the President do now to us under this section? He can do anything the hell he wants. That is, as long as the President does not abolish all of these declarations of national emergency and Congress takes away the right of the President to do so, or keeps a convenient, perpetual, and profitable state of war, in which no declaration of emergency is necessary. It is purely at the President's discretion, and he can use any agency or any license that he desires to control such a state of emergency. He can create as many executive departments as he wishes, like the agencies and departments of domestic and homeland security, the Internal Revenue Service, the National Guard, the FBI, CIA, NSA. This is called a constitutional dictatorship. Very much like the king in England and every other monarchy that has a constitution as well, for pretend, to make people feel like they're free and not under a king. But the problem is this constitutional dictatorship literally is allowed in the Constitution. And once again, in 1973, our Congress declared in Senate Document 93-549 that we've been reading that a serious emergency exists. Here's what it said again. 48 Statute 1, the exclusion of domestic transactions formerly found in the Act of 1917 was deleted from Section 5B at this time. That's even in the report. Supreme Court decision of Stower versus Wallace. This is in 1921. Here's what it says. The Trading with the Enemy Act, originally and as amended, is strictly a war measure, and finds its sanction in the provision empowering Congress, quote, to declare war, grant letters of marque and reprisal, and make rules concerning captures on land and water. Again, that's Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 11. So the court in 1921 here is acknowledging this is strictly a war measure. This cannot be in peacetime. But have you studied your suspended Constitution, my foolish friends? Congress shall have the power to declare war, it says. Grant letters of marque and reprisal, and make all rules concerning the captures on the land and the water of the enemies. That's the Constitution, folks. Who's the enemies? Congress shall have the power to declare war, grant letters of marque and reprisal, and make all rules concerning the captures on land and the water. Why can you be sent? Why can you go through rendition, folks? You guys know what rendition is? It's where they just take you in the middle of the night, put a bag over your head, you wake up in some prison in frickin' Cuba. Okay, that is perfectly sanctioned under this. This is our system. There's no getting around this, folks. I mean, this. As shocking as this might be to those who haven't heard it before, this explains everything. It explains every question you might ever ask about why things are the way they are. You never ever again have to ask why government seems to have complete tyrannical control over everything. It's right here. It's spelled out for you. They do. And because you're its member, its citizen, and you don't do anything about it, and because you actually allow your children to join the military, because these completely uneducated kids go into the military, have no idea what it is they're actually supporting. This is where we are. You see, this has to get out. This information has to get out. And it has to get to people in the military. It has to get, people have to know what it is they're joining. People have to know that they are protecting government from the people, not the other way around. If this is the case, then let's look at the memorandum of law that now occurs in the Trading with the Enemies Act. Quote, the Memorandum of American Cases and Recent English Cases on the Law of Trading with the Enemy. Remembering that we are now indistinguishable from, quote-unquote, the enemy. The enemy and the citizen, the denizen, is the same. In this memorandum we read... All right, these are old cases now. It's just so you understand how this works. Remember, you are, for all intents and purposes, a ship on the sea of commerce. That is why they call it a citizen ship. Remember, you have to think metaphorically. You have to remember the water, it doesn't... The whole structure that we covered in previous shows, the whole problem is that the water has... The jurisdiction of the water has been extended over the land so that you can you're no longer part of the land. You're strictly in a ship floating on the Sea of Commerce. And that is what the United States jurisdiction is. Commercial, admiralty, maritime law. Everything about it. So let's look at, why do I say, because when you go back and you understand that this maritime law used to only be on this actual sea for ships, right? Insurance and everything on the sea, well, then you can understand why they made virtual ships called citizen ships, so that we could then have a vessel to do international commerce on this artificial sea that they extended, which we proved in past shows through the courts. So now we're talking about real ships, but, you know, remember, you're a ship too. Your person is, your status. Quote, after a declaration of... This is the Rapid 12 U.S. 8 Cronch 155 from 1814. This is a U.S. Supreme Court decision. The Rapid, which is a ship, by the way. The Rapid. That's the name of a ship. Quote, after a declaration of a war, an American citizen cannot lawfully send a vessel to the enemy's country to bring away his property. Every species of intercourse with the enemy is illegal. This prohibition is not limited to mere commercial intercourse. Then you have the Julia from 1833. The Julia is a ship. A Supreme Court decision. No contract is considered as valid between enemies, at least so far as to give them remedy in the courts of either government, and they have, in the language of the civil law, no ability to sustain a persona stand in judicio. You hear that, folks? You have no right to sustain a person. Well, wait a minute. You say you are a person. No. You have... If a persona can be taken away from you, then you are not that persona. And in this case, in the language of the civil law, you would have no ability to sustain a persona stand in the court. In other words, enemies have no personal rights at law in court. And with the amended version of the Trading with the Enemies Act now stating that it takes for all citizens to be an enemy is a word from the president, that's all it takes. Or the Treasury Secretary, for that matter. One can see that this Supreme Court decision holds precedent of law over any one of us. Because we're ships, remember? We're in person, we're in that persona, we're in that ship. At any time, at any place in the world, essentially everyone in the world is a potential enemy of the United States by virtue of this amended act. You have no constitutional protections. It's a lie. Ever heard of the phrase, enemy combatant? How about domestic terrorist or insurgent, which we covered last show? These aren't terrorists. They're enemies of the United States fighting for their homeland, for their states, for their land, fighting the virtual water and maritime jurisdiction, who will not cooperate with the wishes of the executive department's tyrannical war powers demands. Heck, let's face it, most of these insurgents are nothing more than starving refugees with no place else left to go after the U.S. military and its private mercenary security forces, private forces hired by the government, destroy the infrastructure of their uncooperative government and country, killing men, women, and children, livestock, and pets, destroying the water supply, destroying the food supply, the transportation supply, chalking it up as collateral damage. Oh, okay. Yeah, you see, that's what we do to domestic terrorists or insurgents in other countries that are trying to protect their land against us. Yes. Here's another ship, the Sally Porter Master, 12 U.S. Code 382. March 15th, 1844, this was an appeal from the decree of the Circuit Court for the District of Massachusetts. Here's what it says. Quote, by the general law of prize, property engaged in an illegal intercourse with the enemy is deemed enemy property. It is of no consequence whether it belong to an ally or to a citizen. The illegal traffic stamps it with the hostile character and attaches it to the penal consequences of enemy ownership. Now remember, folks, enemies, if you're an enemy, if you're declared an enemy, and you all are, then there is no possible way that you can claim property. If you are claiming property, your title, your mortgage, etc., all they got to do is say you're an enemy and they take your property. Remember what the Constitution says, except, right? The exception clauses, they can do that without due process of law because they've declared you an enemy, right? That's the exception in the Constitution. That's why it's bogus. It doesn't mean anything. Here's the rapid again. From 1814, the law of prize is part of the law of nations. In it, a hostile character is attached to trade independently of the charter of the trader who pursues or directs it. Condemnation to the use of the captor is equally the fate of the property of the belligerent and of the property found engaged in anti-neutral trade. But a citizen or an ally may be engaged in a hostile trade, and thereby involve his property in the fate of those in whose cause he embarks. Now, see, you got to understand, folks, your child is considered a prize. When you abandon your child at birth, filling out the vital statistics to create a birth certificate, that is an abandonment, a delivery of that child. He is then because you're not declaring parental rights. This is all in my book, by the way, very well explained. Because you are not declaring parental rights, because you are abandoning your child to the state to become a ward of the state, in which you will get custody, but you're not considered the state is always the highest. You got to understand that your child is found. That's why they call abandoned children a foundling. That's why they have foundling hospitals. Right? So, literally, your child is a prize of the United States. You're an enemy. So, anything you produce, anything you trade, you're an enemy. Your child is a prize. The produce of the soil of the hostile territory, as well as other property engaged in the commerce of the hostile power, is the source of its wealth and strength, are always regarded as legitimate prize without regard to the domicile of the owner. Without regard to the domicile of the owner. Your domicile as a U.S. citizen is Washington, D.C. It's the United States. It's the jurisdiction thereof. Your domicile is not the state that you live in. That's only your residence. And again, the difference between domicile, dom coming from dominion, and residence, res meaning thing, is well explained in my book. Strawmanstory.info. That's the website. Download that sucker. It's free. From the case of the William Begley, 1866, another ship. Now remember, these ships are going around, they're flying the U.S. flag. So under the law of nations, the international law, you're flying your flag, you're bearing your arms. In general, during war, contracts with or powers of attorney or agency from the enemy executed after outbreak of war are illegal and void. Contracts entered into with the enemy prior to the war are either suspended or are absolutely terminated. Partnerships with an enemy are dissolved. Powers of attorney from the enemy, with certain exceptions, lapse. Payments to the enemy, except to agents in the United States appointed prior to the war and confirmed since war, are illegal and void. And rights of an enemy to sue in the courts are suspended. So, folks, there you go. There's your rendition. Why can they rendition you? Why can they come into your home, put a hood over you, beat the shit out of you, drug you, do whatever the hell they want, put you in a foreign prison? Because all rights of an enemy to sue in the courts are suspended. All they have to do is say you're an enemy. Are you starting to get it? Are you starting to see how this works? Isn't this amazing? Because it really does explain. It explains everything, man. This explains everything. Everything. Only have time for a little bit more. With these decisions set in earlier courts, we can see where the later passed and horrifically amended Trading with the Enemy Act of 1917 gets its precedent. So here are some questions we should be asking ourselves in these modern times. If China is listed as a communist country, and if the United States government defines these communist countries like China, North Korea, Cuba, etc. as enemies of its democracy, has not the United States and all corporations that do business in China and sell Chinese goods in America, haven't they committed vast crimes according to the Trading with the Enemy Act? If communism is the enemy of self-proclaimed democracy, or more accurately, what was but is no longer a republic form of government granted in the United States Constitution, is it not true that any corporation purchasing, exporting, importing, transporting, or selling Chinese, Russian, or any other country like that we consider an enemy, or other communist-made products, is in fact trading with the enemy? Shouldn't that include Israel especially? An illegitimate state according to the United Nations? From Senate Report number 113, in which we find an act to define, regulate, and punish trading with the enemy. And for other purposes, we read, the trade or commerce regulated or prohibited is defined in subsections A, B, C, D, and E, page 4. This trade covers almost every imaginable transaction and is forbidden and made unlawful except when allowed under the form of licenses issued by the Secretary of Commerce. Oh, that's why corporations, and that's why import-export, that's why the government is constantly in bed with these foreign countries that are supposedly our enemies and communist. License. Remember, license means lawlessness. It's anarchy. It's organized crime. Organized anarchy, folks. Oh, of course. Now it all makes sense. They give themselves a license. You, as an enemy, can't do it, but they can. This authorization of the trading under licenses constitutes the principal modification of the rule of international law forbidding trade between the citizens of belligerents for the power to grant such licenses. And therefore, exemption from the operation of law is given by the bill. Exemption from law is given to government and whoever it gives license to break every imaginable law. So the government decided that if the ability to profit from trading with the enemy was good and at hand, the government could grant itself and its investment-held corporations the privilege to trade with the enemy. Not us. So what if we have here is a crime, basically organized crime, through this enemy trading organized by license and government-granted privilege. In other words, the government is implementing what is known as organized crime. I mean, what else can you call it? It says that no trade or intercourse can be conducted without a license. No law can be broken unless we allow it. Because by the mere definition of what government calls the enemy, and under the prize law, all trade and intercourse is illegal without license or permission, right? Remember, once people are declared enemies, all trade and intercourse became illegal for us. Or potentially so. Again, you got to consider that at any time this can happen to you. The only way we could now do business or any type of legal intercourse, even between ourselves, was to obtain permission from our government by means of a license. We're required to have a Social Security card, which is a license to work and participate in commerce. This is why they ask you for that card. We must have a driver's license, which gives us the government the ability to restrict travel and create new taxes in the form of fines and fees based on the corporate codes it requires us to follow in order to obtain and keep that license. All businesses in which we engage ourselves require us to have a license, from company incorporation to doing business as even non-profit status. All products we buy require us to pay sales tax, except the very few items that the government hasn't gotten around to attaching a tax yet. Everything we do requires the permission of government. Hunting, fishing, building, digging, driving, medication choices, the burial of our beloved family members. And government even mandates the age in which you may legally retire through Social Security. There is even a death tax. Memorandum of law states that, quote, "But it is necessary always to bear in mind that a war cannot be carried on without hurting somebody, even at times our own citizens. The public good, however, must prevail over private gain. As we said in Bishop versus Jones, 28 Texas 294, there cannot be, quote, a war for arms and a peace of commerce. One of the most important features of the bill is that which provides for the temporary taking over of the enemy property." Folks, remember, even the Constitution says, it talks about quarters. You can't, the army can't take over your quarters except or unless in times of, there. Are you starting to get the picture, folks? If after this, you guys aren't seeing reality here, I have to give up. I mean, everything I've said today is completely sourced. You can verify it all yourself. Since we're running out of time, did I miss anything today? I don't know. I'll tell you what, we'll wrap it up there because, what more can I say? We can go on. Maybe I'll continue this next week a little bit. But, folks, you are the enemy. You have no constitutional rights. You have nothing. You're a militarily conquered nation. You're a militarily conquered people. States cannot secede. This was my goal. Shortly after 9/11, I became an activist. and shortly after I quit my job in Hollywood in 2008, I became a full-time activist. And I've been doing this ever since. Does anybody out there listening? Does anybody out there get what I'm saying? Why don't you send me? I'm in need of some emails, man. Send me some emails. Send me some love. Tell me that you're getting this. Tell me that you understand what I've said. Tell me that you've realized that you're defeated. That you understand that you're at the lowest possible status you could possibly be. You're a prisoner of war in an open-air prison, debtor's prison. Tell me you understand that. Tell me you still don't think or dream or hope that this can be changed. Tell me that you understand that Congress is complicit. Just tell me anything that says that you're getting what I'm saying. I'd really appreciate that. For now, we'll call it a day. We'll call it a show. Thanks for joining me here at UCY.TV. This has been Red Pill Sunday School, and we'll continue this next week. Take care, folks.